Hello again. In Britain, there has for the last couple of years been a positive mania for ridding ourselves of any public memorial to men who had any connection, no matter how tenuous, to the transatlantic slave trade. Even those who had no part in it themselves, but whose families might have profited from the business, are now regarded as suspect. Men like Victorian Prime Minister William Gladstone, for example, whose father owned plantations in Guyana and Jamaica. In the United States, after the death of George Floyd in 2020, statues of those who were supposed by protesters to be involved in this particular slave trade were defaced or pulled down. In Britain, such a statue in the port of Bristol, once an important city in the transatlantic slave trade, was toppled and then thrown in the harbour. Nobody at that time wished to be reminded of the part which black Africans themselves played in the slave trade, all the blame being heaped solely and exclusively upon white people. There were those who raised their eyebrows at this enthusiasm, though, for the destruction of statues, and wondered why it didn't extend to Africa itself. There is a square in the Nigerian capital Lagos, which is named after a woman called Efunroye Tinubu. A statue of her stands in the town of Abeokuta. This statue is interesting because it commemorates a 19th century Yoruba woman who was something of a kingmaker. She is very famous in Nigeria, not least for the fact that much of her wealth came from the slave trade. This was not in the modern sense that perhaps her great-grandfather had owned shares in a company which had commercial interests in the Caribbean, but rather that she herself had bought and sold slaves and by doing so made a fortune. This is such a curious story that it might be worth relating it here. I will draw your attention to the thumbnail to this video, which shows a picture of the statue of this woman. Before going further, we must observe that at no time have any Nigerians ever appeared to be ashamed or embarrassed about the statue of this slave trader. On the contrary, they're proud of her. Efunroye Tinubu was born into a Yoruba family in what is now Nigeria in 1810. Her father was a merchant, and his daughter followed in his footsteps, specialising in the buying and selling of salt and tobacco, and slaves. She married several times, one of her husbands being an Oba, or king, who was in exile. Tinubu managed to restore him to his throne in Lagos, but then when he died, found herself forced into exile. She continued to trade in slaves and also branched out into gun running. In 1851, the British Navy shelled Lagos as part of their efforts to stamp out slavery in Africa. The following year, a formal treaty was signed in which the kings and chiefs of Nigeria agreed that they would no longer tolerate the practice in areas under their control. There was a great reluctance on the part of many people in this part of Africa to give up what they regarded as a time-honoured and traditional occupation. Efunroye Tinubu was one of those who felt that the treaty was an infringement on her rights. She was challenged about this and mounted a spirited defence of her actions. On one occasion, during her final sojourn in Abeokuta, she was alleged to have sold a young boy into slavery and was accused of this. When arraigned before Ogundipe Atalitis, the chief there, over the matter, she reportedly explained, "I have a large household and I must feed them well. I need money to do that. That's why." On another occasion, Tinubu was told that she really had to free all the remaining slaves in her possession. Instead, she tried to sell them to a Portuguese trader called Domingo Martinez. When she felt that he was trying to cheat her, she said, and nobody doubted her word for a moment, that she would sooner drown the 20 men and women whom she was haggling about than sell them at too low a price. The practice of slavery and the trade in captive humans was flourishing among Africans in the 19th century. In fact, many of them felt indignant at the idea of being forced to free slaves and stop buying and selling them in the future. Efunroye Tinubu is regarded in Nigeria as something of a heroine for her resistance to British influence. and this led to a statue being erected to her in the town of Abeokuta, where she spent a large part of her life. It is amusing to note that with all the fuss about statues in Britain with links to the slave trade, nobody in Nigeria seems in the least inclined to deface Tinubu's statue. That she traded in slaves is common knowledge, but has not diminished her standing in the modern country. I fancy personally that we should adopt a more robust attitude to our own statues. If black Africans are not afraid of their slave traders, or ashamed of them, I don't really see why we should be. As usual, references to be found in the description of this video.